Down. Hey, two down. Say that, police. If you're in here, anybody come out.
Nearly 3 years after a fatal shooting shattered a family's home, a California courtroom has delivered its final answer. A jury has found the former partner of Frances Lucero guilty of murder, concluding a long and closely watched trial that traced its origins back to a violent night in Daly City. Lucero was shot and killed at her parents' home, a place meant to offer safety, now forever linked to loss. Throughout the proceedings, jurors heard how an intimate relationship ended not in separation, but in gunfire. Prosecutors argued that the killing was deliberate, the final act in a pattern of control and conflict that escalated with devastating consequences. The defense challenged that account, but after weeks of testimony and evidence, the jury reached a unanimous verdict. The accused's name has not been publicly released, a decision consistent with reporting standards and court protections. What is now public, however, is the outcome: guilty. The verdict brings legal closure to a case that has lingered for years, reopening wounds for the victim's family while they waited for accountability. For Frances Lucero's loved ones, the decision marks the end of a painful legal chapter, but not the end of grief. For the justice system, it represents the conclusion of a trial built on evidence, witness testimony, and the burden of proof required in criminal court. This is a story about domestic violence, delayed justice, and what it means when a verdict finally arrives, years after a life was taken. Nearly 3 years after a single burst of gunfire ended a young woman's life, a California courtroom delivered a verdict that many had waited years to hear. A jury found the former partner of Frances Lucero guilty of murder, bringing legal closure to a case that began with a fatal shooting at her parents' home in Daly City and unfolded through a long, emotionally charged trial. The verdict marks the end of one chapter, but not the end of grief, for a family that has lived with loss since that night. For the justice system, it represents the conclusion of a case built slowly and deliberately, piece by piece, under the highest burden of proof required by law. Frances Lucero was killed at a place meant to offer safety. According to evidence presented in court, she was at her parents' home when she was shot by her ex-partner following the breakdown of their relationship. Prosecutors told jurors that the killing was not spontaneous, but the result of escalating conflict that culminated in a deliberate act of violence. The defense contested that narrative throughout the trial. Ultimately, after hearing all the evidence, the jury rejected those arguments and returned a guilty verdict. The accused's name has not been released here, consistent with the reporting framework set out for this project. What is established beyond dispute is the outcome, a unanimous jury decision that affirms criminal responsibility for Lucero's death. In court filings and public statements, Frances Lucero was described not only as a victim, but as a daughter, a mother, and a woman building a future. She worked in an optical clinic and also ran a small creative business, designing and selling crystal jewelry. Friends and relatives spoke of her warmth, her drive, and her devotion to her children. Those children, still very young at the time of the killing, have remained at the heart of the case's emotional weight. Prosecutors emphasized that Lucero's death did not occur in isolation. It shattered a family structure and left lasting trauma that the court could not ignore. The jury heard how the shooting unfolded at close range, at a location where Lucero should have been protected rather than endangered. Throughout the trial, the courtroom returned again and again to the contrast between the ordinariness of the setting and the finality of what happened there. This was not a remote location or a hidden crime scene. It was a family home, turned into a place of irreversible loss. The path to verdict was not quick. The case moved through investigations, pretrial motions, delays, and a full jury trial that spanned weeks. Such timelines are not unusual in homicide cases, particularly those involving intimate partners, where evidence is complex and testimony emotionally charged. Prosecutors built their case around forensic evidence, witness accounts, and a reconstruction of the events leading up to the shooting. Jurors were shown how the relationship between Lucero and the accused had deteriorated, and how that deterioration, prosecutors argued, escalated into lethal violence. The state emphasized intent, arguing that the shooting was not accidental or provoked in the moment, but the culmination of control and conflict. The defense challenged these claims, questioning interpretations of evidence and urging jurors to consider alternative explanations. As in all criminal trials, the burden rested entirely with the prosecution to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The verdict indicates that jurors concluded that burden was met. When the jury returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense and heavy. A guilty verdict in a murder trial carries weight not only for the defendant, but for everyone connected to the case. It affirms accountability under the law, but it also confirms the permanence of what cannot be undone. For Lucero's family, the verdict brought a measure of legal closure. Family members have spoken publicly about relief that the trial ended with a clear outcome, even as they acknowledged that no verdict could restore what was lost. Grief does not end when a jury speaks. It simply changes form. The court now moves toward sentencing, a phase that will determine the length and conditions of punishment. In California, murder convictions carry severe penalties, reflecting the seriousness with which the state treats the taking of a life. Sentencing hearings often revisit many of the same facts heard at trial, but through a different lens, one focused on consequences rather than guilt. Beyond the individual case, the verdict has resonated within broader conversations about domestic violence and intimate partner homicide. Advocates point out that such killings rarely occur without warning signs. Patterns of control, jealousy, or intimidation often precede violence, even if those patterns are not always visible from the outside. During the trial, prosecutors emphasized this context carefully, without turning the case into a general commentary. Their focus remained on the specific facts surrounding Lucero's death. Still, the verdict has renewed attention on the legal system's role in responding to domestic violence and on the importance of intervention before conflicts escalate beyond control. Legal experts note that homicide cases involving former partners are among the most challenging to prosecute. Emotions run high, evidence can be deeply personal, and jurors must navigate narratives shaped by relationships rather than strangers. The guilty verdict suggests that jurors were persuaded by the consistency and strength of the evidence presented. Although the crime occurred at a private residence, its impact has been public and lasting. Daly City residents followed the case closely, particularly as it wound its way through the courts over multiple years. The verdict prompted reflection not only on the crime itself, but on how communities support victims of domestic violence and their families. Memorials and tributes over the years have kept Lucero's name visible, even as legal proceedings unfolded slowly. For many, the verdict represented acknowledgement, by the state and by the law, of harm that could not be minimized or overlooked. Courts often stress that verdicts are not statements of moral closure, but of legal conclusion. Still, for families and communities, such conclusions matter. They define how a death is recorded in history, not as an unresolved tragedy, but as a crime answered by accountability. With the guilty verdict now entered, the case moves into its final procedural stages. Sentencing will formalize the punishment imposed by the court, and appeals, common in serious felony cases, may follow. Appeals do not retry facts, but examine whether legal errors occurred during the trial. Until such proceedings are exhausted, the case remains part of the justice system's ongoing work. For the public, attention may shift elsewhere. For Lucero's family, the path forward remains deeply personal. Legal closure does not erase memory, nor does it diminish absence. It simply draws a line under one chapter of a story no one asked to live. The jury's decision answers the legal question at the heart of the case: who is responsible for Frances Lucero's death? It does not answer the emotional questions that remain for those who loved her. Courts can deliver verdicts, but they cannot restore lives or heal wounds. What the verdict does affirm is a principle central to the justice system: that even years after a crime, accountability can still be pursued and established through evidence, process, and the rule of law. In that sense, the case stands as both a tragedy and a reminder of why the system exists at all. As sentencing approaches, the name Frances Lucero remains the most important one in this story, not simply as a victim of a crime, but as a person whose life and loss compelled a court, a jury, and a community to confront violence with law rather than silence. This verdict closes the trial. It does not close the memory. As the courtroom emptied after the verdict, the legal process did not stop. It shifted. What followed the jury's decision was a quieter phase, one focused less on proving guilt and more on reckoning with consequence. In California's criminal justice system, a guilty verdict in a murder case opens the door to sentencing, victim impact statements, and a formal accounting of harm that extends beyond the facts already established at trial. For the family of Frances Lucero, this stage carries its own weight. The trial required them to listen, day after day, as prosecutors reconstructed the final moments of her life and defense attorneys challenged those reconstructions. Sentencing requires a different kind of endurance. It asks families to speak directly to the court about loss, about absence, about futures that will never unfold, about children who will grow up with memories shaped by tragedy. Victim impact statements are not evidence in the traditional sense, but they are a recognized part of justice. They give voice to harm that cannot be measured in exhibits or timelines. Judges consider them alongside statutory sentencing factors, weighing accountability against legal limits. In cases involving intimate partner violence, these statements often reveal how deeply a single act reverberates through generations. The court will also consider the totality of the verdict. In this case, the jury's findings went beyond murder alone, encompassing related charges and firearm enhancements. Each element carries sentencing implications under California law, shaping the range of punishment available to the judge. While juries determine guilt, judges determine sentence within the framework established by statute and precedent. Legal observers note that sentencing in homicide cases is intentionally structured to be deliberate. It is not meant to be swift or symbolic. The law demands that punishment reflect both the severity of the crime and the circumstances proven in court. That balance between firmness and fairness is a defining feature of the system, particularly in cases that draw public attention. Outside the courthouse, the verdict has already taken on broader meaning. It has been cited by advocates as another reminder of the lethal risks associated with domestic violence, especially when relationships end and control is contested. Patterns discussed at trial, escalation, fixation, and access to weapons, are familiar to those who work in prevention and survivor support. While every case is unique, the underlying dynamics often repeat with alarming consistency. The setting of the crime remains a stark symbol. The shooting occurred at a family home in Daly City, a place associated with protection rather than danger. Jurors heard how proximity to loved ones did not prevent violence, and how the ordinary routines of a day can collapse into irreversible harm in seconds. That contrast between normalcy and catastrophe was central to the prosecution's narrative and resonated strongly with the jury. Throughout the trial, prosecutors emphasized intent and deliberation. They argued that the evidence showed purposeful action rather than an impulsive mistake. The defense countered by urging jurors to consider uncertainty and alternative interpretations. The verdict confirms which narrative the jury found credible, but it does not simplify the emotional landscape. Even when guilt is established, questions linger about how such outcomes could have been prevented. For the children involved, the legal process offers no easy answers. Courts can assign responsibility and impose punishment, but they cannot restore what was lost. Child-focused advocates stress the importance of long-term support, recognizing that trauma does not end with a verdict. School systems, caregivers, and communities often become part of the response, filling gaps left by violence. The case has also drawn attention to the pace of justice. Nearly 3 years passed between the killing and the verdict, a span that can feel interminable to those waiting for resolution. Yet legal professionals emphasize that thoroughness is not delay for its own sake. Complex cases require time to ensure evidence is tested, rights are protected, and outcomes are durable. A rushed verdict risks error, a careful one seeks legitimacy. Appeals remain a possibility, as they do in most serious felony cases. An appeal does not retry facts or relive testimony. It examines whether the trial was conducted according to law. Appellate courts review records for legal error, not to second-guess jurors. This layer of review is another safeguard, reinforcing confidence that verdicts rest on process as well as proof. Public reaction has been measured but intense. Many see the verdict as affirmation that intimate partner violence will be met with accountability, even when cases are complex and time has passed. Others focus on the limits of punishment, noting that sentences cannot heal families or undo trauma. Both perspectives coexist, reflecting the reality that justice addresses responsibility, not restoration. Media coverage has largely emphasized verified facts and the significance of the verdict without sensationalism. That restraint matters. It respects the gravity of the case and the people affected by it, and it helps prevent the distortion that can occur when tragedy is reduced to spectacle. Responsible reporting mirrors the court's approach, precise, careful, and grounded in evidence. For legal practitioners, the case underscores familiar lessons. Jurors respond to coherence and credibility. Evidence must tell a consistent story. Emotional weight matters, but it must be anchored to proof. In cases involving former partners, establishing intent often hinges on patterns rather than isolated moments. Communications, movements, and decisions that, taken together, clarify motive and action. The sentencing hearing will provide another opportunity for the court to speak formally about harm and responsibility. Judges often articulate how the law views the offense, the reasons for the sentence imposed, and the principles guiding that decision. These statements become part of the public record, shaping how the case is understood long after headlines fade. For Frances Lucero's family, the path forward remains deeply personal. Legal closure can coexist with ongoing grief. Many families describe the verdict as a necessary step rather than an ending, a point at which the legal system has done its part, even as life continues under altered circumstances. Support networks often become more important at this stage, as attention shifts away and private loss remains. The case also contributes to broader institutional learning. Prosecutors, judges, and advocates review outcomes to refine practice, how evidence is presented, how victims are supported, how juries are guided. While no single case transforms the system, each one adds to a body of experience that shapes future responses. In the end, the verdict answers the law's question, not life's. It identifies responsibility and affirms consequence. It does not restore what was taken, nor does it erase pain. What it does provide is a record, a clear statement that violence has consequences measured by law, not silence. As the court prepares for sentencing, the focus remains on due process and proportion. The machinery of justice continues to move, slower than emotion, but steadier than impulse. For a community that has watched and waited, that steadiness matters. It signals that even after years, the law can speak with clarity. The name Frances Lucero will continue to be spoken in legal records and family memory alike. The verdict ensures that her death is not an unresolved question, but an answered one. And while answers do not heal, they do set a boundary between what is tolerated and what is condemned, marking the place where law stands against violence. As the case moves deeper into its final legal stages, the focus turns increasingly toward responsibility, consequence, and what justice looks like after a jury has spoken. A guilty verdict establishes criminal accountability, but it also opens a space for reflection about how the system responds to intimate partner violence, how warning signs are interpreted, and how institutions balance punishment with prevention. In the courtroom, sentencing preparations bring together many of the same facts jurors heard during trial, but framed differently. The question is no longer whether the crime occurred or who committed it, but how the law should respond. Judges consider statutory guidelines, aggravating factors, and the broader impact of the offense. In this case, the killing of Frances Lucero at her parents' home carries particular weight. Courts recognize that violence in domestic settings often involves abuse of trust and proximity, factors that can influence sentencing severity. Victim impact statements are expected to play a central role. These statements allow family members to describe, in their own words, how the loss has reshaped their lives. Judges listen not as fact-finders, those facts have already been decided, but as arbiters of consequence. The law permits this space because harm does not end at the moment of death. It radiates outward, affecting children, parents, siblings, and entire communities. For Lucero's family, speaking in court is both an opportunity and a burden. Many families describe it as a moment of reclaiming voice after years of being defined by legal process. Others find it emotionally exhausting, reopening wounds they have spent months or years trying to manage. Courts provide support and structure for these moments, but they cannot remove the emotional cost. The sentencing phase also brings attention back to the children involved. While their identities and experiences are protected, the law acknowledges that witnessing or being proximate to lethal violence can cause long-term trauma. Findings related to child harm and firearm use, which the jury upheld, underscore the gravity of the offense beyond the immediate loss of life. These findings are not symbolic. They directly affect sentencing ranges and judicial discretion. Outside the courtroom, advocacy groups have pointed to the verdict as evidence of accountability, but also as a reminder of systemic challenges. Intimate partner violence remains a persistent problem across the United States, cutting across socioeconomic and cultural lines. Many cases escalate over time, with periods of separation or attempted reconciliation posing heightened risk. Experts emphasize that prevention requires earlier intervention, access to support services, and careful attention to warning signs that may be dismissed as private disputes until it is too late. The case has also highlighted the role of firearms in domestic violence outcomes. Prosecutors argued, and the jury accepted, that access to a gun transformed conflict into fatality. Research consistently shows that the presence of a firearm dramatically increases the risk of homicide in domestic situations. Courts cannot legislate prevention, but their rulings contribute to the legal landscape that governs accountability when lethal force is used. In Daly City, the case has left a quiet but lasting imprint. Neighbors have spoken about the shock of learning that violence occurred so close to home, in a space associated with family and safety. Over time, visible signs fade, flowers removed, tape gone, but memory persists. Communities often carry these stories forward as cautionary markers, shaping conversations about safety and support. From a legal perspective, the trial itself has become a point of reference. Prosecutors demonstrated how circumstantial evidence, when coherent and consistent, can meet the high burden of proof required in murder cases. Defense counsel exercised their role by challenging interpretations and emphasizing doubt. The jury's verdict reflects the system functioning as designed. Competing narratives tested in open court, resolved by citizens instructed to weigh evidence impartially. Appeals, if filed, will focus on questions of law rather than fact. Appellate courts review whether procedures were followed, evidence admitted properly, and instructions given correctly. This layer of review is not a second trial. It is a safeguard. Its existence reinforces the legitimacy of outcomes by ensuring that verdicts rest not only on evidence, but on correct application of law. As public attention gradually shifts, families often experience a paradox. The verdict brings relief that the legal question has been answered, but it can also intensify the sense of absence. During the trial, loss is constantly acknowledged. Afterward, silence returns. Support networks, family, friends, counseling services become especially important in this phase, when external focus fades but grief remains. For policymakers and practitioners, cases like this inform future practice. Training for law enforcement, prosecutors, and judges increasingly incorporates trauma-informed approaches, recognizing the complexities of domestic violence cases. Courts refine how they manage sensitive testimony, protect vulnerable witnesses, and communicate outcomes responsibly. These incremental changes do not undo harm, but they shape how the system responds next time. The broader public conversation often oscillates between demands for harsher punishment and calls for prevention. Both impulses arise from the same recognition that loss on this scale is unacceptable. The law addresses harm after it occurs. Communities and institutions must address risk before it escalates. The verdict underscores that accountability is possible, but it does not eliminate the need for vigilance. As sentencing approaches, the courtroom will once again fill with meaning. Judges will articulate the rationale behind the sentence, grounding it in statute and evidence. These statements matter. They become part of the public record, explaining how the law understands the offense and why the punishment fits the crime. In doing so, courts affirm values about safety, responsibility, and the sanctity of life. For Frances Lucero, the legal system can offer only one thing: recognition that her death was a crime, answered by consequence. It cannot restore her presence or rewrite what her children will remember, but it can state, unequivocally, that violence within intimate relationships is not a private matter shielded from accountability. As the process continues, the case stands as both conclusion and warning. Conclusion, because the jury has spoken and responsibility has been established. Warning, because the patterns revealed, escalation, access to weapons, unresolved control, are not unique. They appear again and again in courtrooms across the country. Justice in this sense is not a single moment. It is a series of decisions by jurors, judges, and institutions, guided by evidence and law. The verdict marks a critical point on that path. What follows will determine how consequence is formalized, how memory is honored, and how lessons are carried forward. The name Frances Lucero remains at the center of that reckoning, not as a headline, but as a person whose life and death compelled a community, a court, and a jury to confront violence with clarity. The law has spoken. The responsibility now is to listen to what the verdict affirms and to what it warns against repeating. As the legal process reaches its final stretch, the meaning of the verdict settles into focus, not as a dramatic ending, but as a formal acknowledgement of responsibility under the law. A jury has spoken, and with that decision, the case of Frances Lucero moves from the question of guilt to the lasting work of consequence and memory. For the court, this stage is measured and procedural. Sentencing formalizes what the verdict already established, translating accountability into a concrete penalty defined by statute and precedent. Judges weigh aggravating factors, consider victim impact, and articulate the reasons behind the sentence imposed. These statements matter. They explain how the law understands the harm done and why the punishment fits the crime, creating a record that outlives the case itself. For families, the end of a trial rarely feels like an end at all. Legal closure can coexist with ongoing grief. Many describe a quiet shift after the verdict, relief that the process concluded with clarity, followed by the return of absence. Once courtrooms empty and attention fades, support often becomes more important here, when public focus moves on, but private loss remains. The broader significance of the case lies in what it affirms. It affirms that intimate partner violence is not a private matter beyond accountability. It affirms that time does not erase responsibility, even when years pass between a crime and a verdict. And it affirms the role of juries, ordinary citizens, asked to evaluate evidence carefully and decide, without spectacle, on the most serious questions the law can pose. Cases like this also underscore the limits of the justice system. Courts can determine guilt and impose punishment. They cannot restore what was taken. They cannot undo trauma or rewrite childhoods shaped by loss. What they can do is draw a clear line between conflict and crime, between harm and consequence, and state that violence has a price measured by law. In Daly City, the place where the crime occurred, daily life continues. Streets return to routine. homes resume their quiet rhythms. Yet memory persists. Communities carry these stories forward as caution and resolve, shaping how people think about safety, intervention, and care. Over time, the visible signs fade, but the lesson remains. Proximity does not equal safety when control turns to violence. For advocates and practitioners, the verdict reinforces familiar truths. Risk often rises at moments of separation. Access to firearms escalates lethality. Early intervention and support matter. While no single case changes a system, each one adds to the understanding that prevention must begin long before a courtroom is involved. The appellate process, if pursued, will examine law rather than fact, ensuring procedures were followed and rights protected. This layer of review is a safeguard, not a retrial, and it strengthens confidence that outcomes rest on process as well as proof. It is another reminder that justice is designed to be careful, not quick. As public attention turns elsewhere, what remains is the record. Evidence tested, arguments weighed, a verdict rendered. The name Frances Lucero remains central to that record, not as a statistic, but as a person whose life compelled accountability. Remembering that distinction matters. It keeps the focus on humanity rather than abstraction. Justice, in the end, is not an eraser. It does not remove pain or replace presence. It is a statement, clear, deliberate, and bound by law, that harm has been recognized and answered. In making that statement, the system fulfills its narrow but essential role. If you value fact-checked, responsible cinematic news storytelling, like this video to support careful reporting. Share it so others can understand the full context beyond headlines, and subscribe for more in-depth investigations that follow evidence, respect process, and center the people affected. We don't rush judgment, we respect the law, and we stay with the truth.